record on this computer. There we go. Okay, I always like to start out by just kind of reviewing our agenda for the day so you know what's coming up. We always start out our resource groups with a thank you to sponsors and an introduction to our contributor spotlight person who is spotlighted. Today it'll be Dustin. And then once we get through kind of the formalities of housekeeping, then we'll do our contributor spotlight session and focus on one area of the industry. And Dustin's willing to take questions as he goes today too. So ask questions as you have them. And once we kind of get to a natural break, we'll take any general questions for the group or just keep quizzing Dustin about, you know, his world and how it relates to that of the rest of ours. I always try to revisit our mission as well. Start a Brewery was the brainchild, actually the opportunity that arose in Candace's email box. And she and I put together a website called Start a Brewery. And the point is to build a library of free resources for those who are starting breweries, kind of raise the knowledge bar, make all of that information available to everybody, raise the bar for breweries. And it will also serve as lowering the bar to entry for anyone who doesn't have these resources or know where to find them. So this is our overall goal. We have an awesome family of contributors in the craft beer industry that have been in the industry forever. And I shouldn't say forever, that's a loose term, a long time. And some fantastic people that are always welcome, always willing to take questions and direct you in great resource directions or help you themselves. So next, just for your calendars, our next session will be July 20th. So you can put that on your calendar. That's a Wednesday also. And William Camacho is going to talk about pro formas. So maybe Dustin can mention how pro formas fit into his world as well. Our contributor spotlight today shines on Dustin Hauk Architecture. Dustin's been in the industry quite a while and is going to help us understand how his company works with startups and expanding breweries in terms of location and brewery design. So Dustin, take it away.
Okay, I'm just updating my calendar here to put that next date in here. Okay, got that. All right. So as Horace mentioned, I'm an architect. We specialize in the craft beer industry. What that means is that we pretty much only work on brewery projects. I come from a long home brewing background with the Quaff Homebrew Club, and saw some friends wanting to build breweries, and I knew the architecture side, I knew the brewing side of it, at least to some extent at that point, and thought we'd take a look at it and do one and see, you know, have some fun doing it. That was almost 12 years ago. That kind of snowballed into breweries being the only project type that we work on. Anything related to craft beer, whether it's a new brewery, an expansion, a satellite tap room, or maybe even a craft beer focused bar. And that's pretty much all the project types we work on. What kind of differentiates us, I think, is just our experience in the craft beer industry and understanding all of the equipment and the different models there are out there for distribution, product types, cellaring, seltzer, whatever kind of model you're going for, what you're trying to do, even when it comes to mead and cider, and how that equipment and layout and process flow might change how you might lay out your facility. But we try to get brought in as early as possible to help our clients really kind of understand what to be looking for in a space before they get signed into a lease, so we can make sure that the property they're going into is right for them based on what they're looking to do. We help them identify, you know, maybe what zoning is right for it, what building, if we find a building, do kind of some feasibility studies on those to see what some of the hurdles might be. Could oftentimes be some accessibility issues to meet the ADA codes, could be some utility requirements that need to be upgraded, and understanding what that is going to be moving into a project early on instead of being surprised by a big cost later that you weren't prepared for. So once we kind of get them locked into a space that they want to go into, potentially could be new construction as well. we start looking at what their system is going to be, what kind of volume they're looking to produce. It's kind of where we vary from kind of a traditional architect, and that with our background and the brewing side of it, really understanding what you're trying to do, what volumes you're trying to hit, what your system is, what it can do, what volumes it can produce, so that we design that facility to maximize what you can do in there, and plan for that future growth, so that if you want to increase your capacity, the simplest way is just to increase your cellar capacity. So designing that cellar so you can either swap out a tank or drop in a new tank without disrupting operations and keep everything else moving. And then what kind of square footage you need to do that. Cold storage based upon your distribution model, how long you plan on holding beer before you have room for new beer. And kind of sizing the space, and then looking at your process flow of how you're bringing product in, how it's running through the brewery from hot side, cold side, finishing, packaging, storage, serving it to the customer, sending it out to for distribution, kind of how all that works kind of holistically within the facility. And then we also then on the hospitality side of it, the tap room side, potentially there's a kitchen involved or provisions for food trucks or something else like that. How do we best lay that out? What's the best experience for the customers, for them to get into your place, to easily place an order, spend money, really, what's the best way to make it good for them so you can be profitable, that your flow works, whether it's event space or adaptable space, kind of how everything kind of comes together. And then once we kind of work on that design stuff, we start putting together the plan sets that are necessary for all the permits, whether you need it for your planning and zoning approvals, your building permits, which would be the architectural, structural, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing engineering, and getting you through that entire permit process, getting plans submitted to the city, addressing their comments, getting permits pulled, helping our clients find contractors to build it out, answer questions from those contractors during construction, and kind of take them through it. The ideal goal is to set them up from the very beginning to planning what kind of facility they need, all the way through to getting that facility built and opening and operating, and kind of assisting with everything related to design, engineering, and permits within that process. That's kind of in a nutshell what we do and how we do it specifically for the craft beer industry. As Laura mentioned, we do work with William Camacho on occasion. In that pro forma, we can kind of assign that pro forma is going to be sort of built upon how process moves through and what those volumes are that you can produce, and we can build into those schedules if they know what their pro forma looks like as far as when they may need increased capacity. I can tell them how much capacity they can get out of their system based upon their cellar size, and at what point do they need to, add a fermenter or order a fermenter. If a fermenter is going to be 6 to 8 months out, you can kind of use your pro forma to plan that as to when you need to order it, and we'll know where it's going to set in that process. And basically designing that system so that you've got the glycol drops in place, you've got the room to set it there, and you can just bring it in, set it, and essentially drop your glycol lines and passivate it, and you're ready to go. So as little disruption to the brewery as possible. You don't want to be trying to expand your cellar floor during operations. It's a real mess. You pretty much have to shut down operations to do that. Yeah, that's kind of the bulk, kind of a quick rundown of what we do. And it varies for every client as to what they need and what their specific requirements are going to be, and could be different based upon your municipality, your city, your state regulations, wherever you are. We're currently licensed in 27 states, and we just get licensed whichever states come up and need our services for. Because I have a national accreditation, which lets me get reciprocal licensure pretty easily in most states. Yeah, that's in a nutshell what we do. Be happy to answer any questions or go into more detail about some things that we've done. We've worked on over 200 breweries, so pretty much seen and dealt with just about every situation.
Dustin, can you help us with kind of the minimum that you like to have people show up with? You usually get pure dreamers, do you?
We do. We get all kinds. We get established breweries looking to do some major expansions that have been through it before. They may have multiple locations. all the way down to, what you call tire kickers, and just kind of getting a feeler for what's it going to take to do this. And typically we'll do initial consultations at no charge, just to try to get them set up and going in the right direction, and kind of let them know what it's going to take. We do get some people coming to us with unrealistic goals and time and cost of what it takes to open up a brewery, and we kind of open their eyes to that and kind of let them know what they're really in for and making sure they're well suited for it. We want to see the industry thrive, and I want to make sure everybody coming into it is prepared.
If you had just a few criteria that you would prioritize for somebody who's looking to find a space that's already existing, what would be the most important things that you would want to see in a space that you think makes it most adaptable to a brewery?
Well, I think it's important for them to understand, really know what they're trying to do, and understand the volumes they're trying to hit, because that will really dictate their system size and what it can do, and kind of how hard they want to work to do that. Get somebody coming in that says they want to do 5,000 barrels on a 5-barrel system. They probably don't know how much work that means. And so we can kind of talk to them about that. Well, maybe we upsize the system and you don't have to work so hard, or you bring down your production volumes, make those more realistic. So then when it comes to finding a location, it's got to fit that model of what their volume needs to be, so we can make that production size work. But then when we're evaluating spaces, understanding what they're trying to do, the production volume, what they're looking for on the taproom side. We've seen all different types of models that are, taproom heavy, or some that are distribution heavy. We've even seen some that are mail order only. They only offer a club presence, and there's no way to buy their beer outside of the club, and they don't even operate a tap room. So there's lots of different ways to do it. So looking at spaces really depends. But when it comes to operating a tap room, one of probably the most important things we look for is fire sprinklers in a building. It really changes what you can do. There's limitations in the building code that will require fire separations if your tap rooms are over a certain size, based upon your production volumes and what you're doing in the space. There's several different thresholds depending on what jurisdiction you're in, but understanding what that means, if the building's not equipped with fire sprinklers, what limitations that may put on you. Maybe that means your tap room's got to be smaller, can accommodate less people, or doesn't have a direct view of the brewery. And I think that's really important for a brewery to set themselves apart from a bar, is, give them the experience that they know they're in a brewery, not just in a bar. Let them be able to see that equipment, be part of it, hear the noises, smell the aromas. You want to know that you're in a brewery. And I think that's critical to differentiating themselves.
Are there deal killers like water access, height of ceilings?
Certainly can be. Ceiling heights can be potentially, depending on your system size and whether you want a triple batch or even higher than that, quadruple batch, what size fermentation tanks get in there. Getting those tanks into the building, that can sometimes be a restrictive factor. Some of the things we see, people maybe going into a more industrial setting that wasn't designed to be for have a hospitality component to it, and what that means as far as, like I mentioned, the sprinklers, but potential exiting, number of exits, how you get access to a public way out of that property. Utilities are probably some of the bigger ones that we see buildings being deficient on. You'd find some of these older buildings that may have inadequate electrical systems. They'd be fine for most light manufacturing, but a brewery is fairly power intense, and having to upgrade those systems can be quite costly. And if you don't own the building, you're putting a lot of money into the landlord's property, and kind of understanding what that impact is, and what that cost is going to be is usually significant.
Do you have an opinion about, is it better to have a standalone building or be part of a multi-business complex?
It really depends on the business model and what you're trying to do. We've done it in every way. We've done a small brewery and a multi-tenant. We've done multiple breweries in the same tenant space. We've done standalone buildings. I don't think it really matters, as long as it matches up with your business model and what you're trying to do.
Have you seen spaces that have been a good fit, but the municipality says no?
Normally, we will go through the municipality requirements first. So we're already going to know what zones and what properties are right with the planning and zoning departments that will be amicable to a brewery. Typically, they're going to have their zoning regulations pretty well documented. Whether or not they even mention breweries specifically, we can still plug in light manufacturing and commercial and seeing what options there are. Breweries are kind of unique in that we can consider the tap rooms more of an accessory to the manufacturing use. So that allows us to maybe go into an area where maybe a bar or restaurant's not allowed, but a brewery with a tap room is. But usually we're going to know what zones are right for the brewery, or what maybe some special use permits might be required prior to getting too far down the road, because that can be a deal breaker right out of the gate if you're just in an area that doesn't allow it.
I think I've heard in places there have been issues with smell or issues with sound or issues obviously with parking. Is there a certain like zoning designation that makes all of that not matter?
So zoning is different in every jurisdiction. It's the one thing that can vary from city to town to county. It can be different everywhere. So it really depends upon how they've written their planning and zoning codes and what zones they've planned for in their community. And they're all going to be different. Some may have parking requirements, some don't. They could be based upon the zone, or they could be based upon the actual use of the building. For example, you could have being an industrial zone that maybe they apply one parking space per 500 square feet, regardless of what's happening inside the building. Or they could have it where maybe it's 1 per 500 for manufacturing, 1 for 250 for office space, 1 for 50 for a commercial part of that building. So that'll change depending upon the other occupants in the building. When you get into multi-tenant building, that can be more complicated because you need to know what every tenant is doing and how their square footage could impact the parking requirements and what you're doing. But like I said, that can vary by jurisdiction. So one thing that doesn't vary a whole lot is the building code requirements. There's essentially two main codes in the country: the Uniform Building Code and the International Building Code. Most states have adopted one or the other, usually with some sort of amendments that they've made to those codes. But when it comes to life safety, fire safety, how the buildings are built, those are fairly universal across the states. So most of the time we can really assess kind of what is needed in a particular building code-wise fairly easily, but the zoning it requires a little bit of research into that particular jurisdiction, because it can change. You cross over a line separating you from one city to another, and it'll change dramatically.
Gotcha. Have you seen some places that look like they would be ideal and run into some of the how do you get the equipment in the door sort of things where you'd have to cut holes in ceilings and stuff?
Yeah, we've had to cut holes in ceilings. We had to remove large panes of glass and bring them in through windows. Yeah, we've kind of done it all. Ideally, you've got a space that has a big roll-up door that's going to allow you to not only bring in equipment, but it's going to let you bring in supplies, grain, cans, product, anything like that, and you can use that for all those uses. But on occasion, we've been in spaces that just don't have it, and so how do we make it work for that? We've designed into it ways to remove sections of either a wall or a window or a door, so that when they bring in that new equipment, they can. That new equipment typically only happens a couple of times ever. So even if it means, tearing down a wall for, twice in the lifetime of your brewery just to bring in new equipment, it's usually not that big of a deal, because the value of that equipment and what return you're going to get on it, negates that cost of modifying that wall. But sometimes it may seem easier if we don't have to do that. But sometimes the conditions just don't allow for it, particularly on the bigger side. When we get into some of the big breweries with 100-barrel and larger tanks, sometimes the roof is the most economical way to do it.
Is there a size system that dictates like a silo or any exterior kinds of things that you'd need permission for?
Well, we always recommend to put things outside that make sense and make noise and heat, like your glycol chiller, condensers. Good sometimes to put your CO2, maybe some water treatment. If you have a room for it, you can put a lot of kind of those systems all together in one place. Your boiler, if you have one, to get some of those things out of the building. It's a little bit easier to deal with in that case, but oftentimes we get a building that just doesn't have any outdoor space. We've got to figure out how to put something that really should be outside now inside. You got to deal with fire restrictions. You got to deal with the ventilation, the heat that it produces, the noise that it produces, and different ways to mitigate that. There's a number of different things that can be done. Glycol systems can be split systems where you put smaller units, condensing units on the roof, and keep the weight of the glycol on the ground. Just because a full glycol system can be substantial weight, 2,000-3,000 pounds usually is a minimum, and adding that to the roof of a building that wasn't designed for it can get to be expensive. So yeah, we have lots of different options, just depending on the conditions of the building and what we're looking at. But there's different systems can do different things, and what the requirements are. You may or may not have a boiler, and then there's thresholds for boilers that require fire rated room. So depending on your size of the brewery, can you downsize that boiler just a little bit and not have to provide that fire rated room? Potentially, if your system can run off of it at that size.
Are there similar guidelines for kitchens and restaurant stuff where at some point it might make more sense to do a food truck or some other option instead of having the kitchen?
Yeah, the kitchen really has a lot to do with what your menu wants to be, or what you want it to be. And we'll design a kitchen completely differently from a pizza kitchen versus a burger kitchen or a deli kind of sandwich shop. They're completely different in how they're laid out, what kind of ventilation is needed, and what kind of square footage they take up. Food trucks are a great option, but they've proven to be kind of unreliable and inconsistent. But adding a food component to your business is a whole nother business. It's in understanding that it's a different animal all in itself, and it needs to be treated as such, not as just an accessory part of your brewery, but it's its own business. And if done right, it can be more profitable than the brewery itself.
That makes sense. There are all sorts of little things with the kitchens that seem complicated, but in the end, I guess it's all about whether you want to keep that in-house. I guess there's also the option maybe of renting that space or leasing that space to somebody else to run it.
Yeah, and we've done that as well. Maybe built out a full kitchen that's pretty adaptable, make it done for a lot of different things. And then you can sublease that out to a tenant that wants to be an operator. And that way you don't have to take any of that, but you would have substantial capital depending on how far you went to outfit that facility, and what you wanted to do, and how far along whether it's just creating a shell and they do all the equipment and the TI inside of it, or whether you provide it pretty much blank with equipment and ready to go, which can be real attractive for a tenant. But obviously I would think the rent would be more because the equipment's already there.
Candace, anybody that wants to ask questions, please raise your hand. It's underneath the reactions down at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead, Candace.
I just wanted to mention that in terms of subletting out a kitchen, you got to be very careful that you adhere to your state's tied house laws. So for example, in California, to lease out the kitchen, you cannot lease it to someone who already has an ABC, an alcohol license. You can only lease it to non-retail licensees. Otherwise, it's considered giving a retailer something of value. But that's specific to California. So just that's one of those things that you want to watch out based on the state you're in.
Yeah, making sure that your lease allows you to sublease as well, because your landlord may not let you do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Candace,
adding a kitchen certainly adds complexity. It's just a matter of what's your business plan, what's your model. We can design it in and make it function however you want, but there are other components that got to be looked at. Your licensing, your landlord responsibilities. There's a lot of other things that go into it. As I mentioned, it's a completely another business. So it's not just a side gig to the brewery. They need to make sure they understand that it is a separate business and needs to be treated with the same respect.
Scott, you had a question?
Hey, Dustin, Scott Berkner, SBA lender. I think we met several years ago at one of the beer conferences, and I know you
Yeah, I think
have
so.
you've done some drawings for deals that I've closed. So I do nationwide breweries and distilleries, and every deal we have, unfortunately, includes construction. It's a
Yep.
painful process, and most of the borrowers coming in absolutely don't understand what they're about to get into from your side, and then working with the GCs to get to a contract. So long-winded. The last couple of years, we will continue moving forward with a deal without a contract or, just with a budget, but these budgets are absolutely getting blown out of the water. I just had one in Austin, Texas. The GC budget was 350. Once the full plans and specs were done, it's almost $800,000. And a lot of that is supply chain related and COVID. What are you seeing on your side? Are the plans that you're finishing and they're going out to bid? Are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, everything's costing more, and supply chain's a big part of it, but just raw material costs. I think another thing to consider is just carrying costs are going up because the durations are getting longer. Plan check takes longer than it ever has before. Through different, pretty much every jurisdiction we deal with, they all vary, but they are all, as a whole, much longer than they used to be, maybe 2 or 3 times longer. So, assuming you can submit for a permit and have it in hand within 3 months is not realistic anymore. We've got some projects that are been plan checked for 6, 8 months, and that's just the permit time. That's not the design time ahead of that or the construction time behind that. And I know on the lending side, we get a lot of clients that come to us and say, "Hey, we just need a budget so we can get the loan going." Well, you can do kind of a rough budget based upon maybe a cost per square foot, but without actually doing a design, getting some of the engineering done, and getting it priced out from the contractor, you can't get a real accurate number for that. And so there's got to be some money spent and time spent to get to that point so you can get a realistic construction number. And at least at the time of the bid, I mean, we get projects that might be bid and priced for lending, and then a year later is when they're actually ready to be built, and the industry has changed over that year, and the cost and durations can change.
Yeah, I appreciate that. About 2 years ago, I started adding a 20% construction stress to everybody's budget. And of course, the customer doesn't like that because it increases their project cost, increases their equity into the deal. But then they thank me later when it comes in 30% higher. And at least we had some stress in our deal to commit, because we've had deals that come back around and double, and we just can't get comfortable with some of them. So, I try to talk to the client and let them know, look, we're doing this to protect you. This is probably what's going to happen as you move down the road. And we're probably working on 25 or 30 of these at a time, and not just breweries, but, all of our construction components. And we're just seeing it across the board. So appreciate that.
Yeah, it's all gone up, and it's really difficult to estimate the costs, because it can vary greatly by the building and the project. But I do, on a pretty regular basis, see people coming in with unrealistic expectations as to the time and costs to build a brewery. When you say that somebody coming in at 300,000, I'd be really interested to know what kind of size and scope you can get a brewery done for that amount of money. Probably not very many.
Especially not in Austin, Texas.
Yeah, it's weird. It's gone up kind of everywhere.
It's expensive there.
Yeah. Well, we've even, we try to use builders that have done breweries before, so they have a better feel for what it's going to take. A lot of things that we don't have in the design yet on the early end of it, trying to get some realistic budgets for it. But even then, we've had contractors miss it by double, just not having the full design and being able to price everything, because you can't make assumptions. They don't want to throw out a number for they're assuming that they're going to have, for maybe throw in a number of $100,000 for framing, when the number could come in at half that, or the number could come in at double that, because they haven't seen the plans and haven't been able to price it based upon really what's being done. And you don't get to that point without going through the feasibility study, the design, and the engineering. So there's that cost, that takes time and money to get to that point. And And a lot of, lenders don't want to authorize a loan without having some of those numbers, but there's got to be some stuff done ahead of that to get a realistic number.
Right.
Scott, do you find that your company tends to favor or feel more comfortable when you're dealing with projects that have an architect or someone savvy with the industry involved?
Absolutely. Early on, probably 10, 12 years ago, when I started doing these, we would take a budget on a napkin and start working, and we learned a lot. And so a lot of times the borrowers, they blame us, not just that the price went up, but later on in the process if we're increasing the loan. So we just continue to try to build a better mousetrap. I send out my clients kind of a detailed construction budget from our side, what we see, and I send that to them early on, and I make sure that they've got all their buckets covered, because they usually don't. Right, they've walked the property with a couple of contractors, and this is the like Dustin said, price per square foot, right? Which isn't, we're not there.
Yeah, and it can be all over the board. That number per square foot can vary dramatically, and varying that by even as little as $50 a square foot difference from one project type to another on a decent sized project, that's a big number.
So Laura, I think to answer your question, we, a lot of times it's, we say it's the cart before the horse, because they want us to go ahead and approve a loan, but they don't even know if they can open a brewery in their town yet. Like the customers haven't done a whole lot of due diligence, right? So just depending on our flow, I mean, there's times where we'll work on those and be, patient. And there are other times just, you're not ready. You need to come back. Here's what you need to work on. I'll send them out a detailed, checklist of items that they should be working on. And we're going to want to see a pretty detailed budget. We're now asking to see if we could, the GCs will put something on their letterhead that shows, they've analyzed this property in some detail, not just a price per square foot, because, the customers don't want us to increase that loan. And I get it. We're not doing it to make a bigger loan, but I've had a few deals where, we're doing projection-based lending on a startup. And if those projections don't meet a certain criteria, the loan is not going to be approved per SBA's guidelines, right? So I have to make sure there's enough cushion in there if there's a significant increase in the project. So I'm basically telling them, and it's lender liability, look, you got to increase your projections. You got to have some cushion in there, especially when you have a deal that goes up $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. The other thing that we've been pushing back on is when we have a leasehold, just a leasehold improvement loan that's probably north of $1 million, meaning the client's not buying the real estate, they're just leasing the property. Our credit team starts to feel like that's sort of beyond their comfort level. You're adding $1 million to somebody else's space, and the only collateral the bank has is the equipment, right? We don't get to keep anything that we put into the walls or on the roof, or, so that's just our bank. Other banks may go beyond that. If they're buying the real estate, I mean, we've done $3 and $5 million deals, but that's a different animal because they're purchasing the bricks and mortar.
Right.
But the construction piece, we're always trying to build a better mousetrap, help the client. I had some deals where it increased so much that the projections didn't work, and we can't just turn around to the borrower and say, well, you had to add an air conditioning system, and your electric wasn't adequate and your plumbing wasn't adequate, but you're going to sell more beer, because those three things don't sell more beer, right? So it's hard for the underwriter to say, well, go ahead and just increase your projections and we'll approve your loan. So there's a lot of, and it's been really frustrating after COVID, but this was even going on before COVID. I mean, we do a lot of construction. Almost every deal has a construction piece. And, so I do a pretty thorough analysis with the client. Most of them aren't ready. They don't really have an idea. They don't have a space. I mean, I got 3 today. None of them have a space. So, there's not a whole lot I can do other than talk about the SBA process. And that's another thing not that we're here to talk about SBA loans, but the surprising piece to most of my clients is we can't close the loan next month, right? You have no architect, no GC. They just want to close on a number and then hope for the best. And I said, so what happens when you come off 300,000-400,000 off a budget? You can't come back to us for another loan. So we can't close the loan until you're permit ready. And so that is frustrating to them. I get it. And as Dustin said, the process, City of Charlotte, it could take you 8 months to get through that, from drawings to an approval to pull a permit. I mean, it's a long process right now.
Right. Andrew, let's move to your question. What do you have on your mind?
Yeah, I'll mix it up a little bit. Dustin, always enjoy learning from you. And, you talked about how breweries are adding kitchens or bringing in partners. Are there any other unique trends you're seeing from your point of view on the way breweries are designed these days?
We are seeing some kind of thinking outside of the box on their products potentially, whether it's adding seltzer. Some of the new laws in California, particularly looking at trying to blend wineries and breweries together, potentially being able to have cohabitative facilities, shared taproom spaces. We've just got a new brewery that's going to open hopefully in a week or two, just pending some ABC licenses. That's 3 breweries and 1 winery and 1 kitchen all in one building, that all kind of they share 1 brew house, and they have separate cellars, but you can pretty much, from a patron side of it, you can go in, you can pick from different products, different styles, different brands, and you still get a food component. You've got a wine component. You kind of a dynamic setup for that type of thing. I think you're really kind of expanding their offerings and more of a commitment to the hospitality side of it. I think we all know that the days of opening up a garage brewery and being tremendously successful are long gone. You've got to really put more commitment on the hospitality side of it. Set yourself apart.
Definitely.
Very cool. I had a thought, but I was listening. Anybody else have other questions? Candace, do you have anything you want to throw in here about landlord, tenant, things to look out for?
If I can get my mute thing to work. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot you have to consider, and you definitely want to meet with someone and talk to someone like Dustin before signing a lease, because it is really important to make sure that, the location you're looking at can do what you need it to do, or at least know what it's going to roughly cost you get it to do what you want to do. Because once you sign the lease, I mean, you're on the hook, especially these days, because everyone's requiring personal guarantees. I mean, it's a big step to sign that. And there's, Dustin was talking about like what you have to do to the location to get stuff to fit in. And every standard commercial lease says that you can't, puncture the roof. And I think most people end up needing to puncture the roof. So it's just important to kind of know what you're going to need to do so that you can make sure that you are in compliance with your lease or what you're looking for. And then the other thing that struck me when Dustin was talking about the new concepts where, it's more hospitality focused, that's also a lot more regulatory issues with those. So especially where you have multiple businesses sharing a common consumption area. So basically, and since we're beer folks, I'll say if the winery happens to overserve people, but they're drinking from every establishment in that group is potentially responsible. That's at least in California how the ABC handles it, is when you share consumption, you're all responsible. So, and it's definitely the way things are going, and I think it's great from the consumer perspective, but there's just more to think about and more things you want to run down to make sure that you're not shouldering someone else's liability. So.
Gotcha. Fred, welcome to our contributor world. What's on your mind?
Thanks. How to remember to unmute myself, which may be the catchphrase of the past 2 years.
Yes.
I'm seeing a number of breweries, I'll say more so than distilleries, that are troubled because of COVID shutdown restrictions and things like that, especially if they started, unfortunately, in the spring of 2020. So my question to Dustin is, you talk a little bit about the issues of conversion, in that I'm selling a brewery, but what's involved in like converting it for distillery use or vice versa? Is that extensive? Is that minor? Because it may be another pathway for me to get a deal done and for buyers and sellers to get what they want.
Yeah, I think when you're looking strictly from a distillery standpoint, a distillery for the most part is, depending on what product they're making, is going to be distilling the initial product out of that brewery. So really, to convert a brewery to a distillery is really just adding the still and a little bit different packaging or equipment. There could be other restrictions based upon the volumes that they're looking to do. Distilleries inherently produce higher alcohol, which creates a higher hazard, and there are provisions within the code depending on the volumes of what you're producing at what alcohol levels, what it's being washed down to, what it's being stored at, can really kind of impact that. But if you can stay on the small volume side of it, it's fairly easy to do. But if you get into a little bit larger volume and you're going to be maybe long aging some things in barrels, that ends up with a different kind of dynamic. Typically in a distillery situation, any kind of barrel aging happens completely off-site and not where the still is, for those explosive life safety reasons. But if it came to like another product, mead and cider, those can all be done with most of the same brewing equipment. The breweries will probably overkill for some of those operations, but it's certainly equipment that could be repurposed for that type of thing fairly easily.
Very cool.
Thanks.
I remembered my question. In terms of output of the whole brewery process, are you seeing increases in regulation? Are you seeing more efficiency and more climate-minded brewers? How does that work, and how do you integrate that in the various municipalities in terms of how you treat your waste byproducts? You're muted.
When you're looking at the waste part of it, so we have some calculators that we use. I mean, we've done so many that we have a pretty good feel for what to expect on the waste side based upon their production volume, at least to provide some initial estimates for the municipalities when they're concerned about what they may be sending down the drain. And then we design all of our systems with sample ports and diversion pits, so that if they can, once they're operating, they can monitor what they're doing and making sure they're in compliance. If they run into a problem, they've got a way to divert out of that and treat that before it gets dumped down the drain line. So I don't know that I would say that we've seen any kind of more leniency on the municipality's part. Their restrictions are going to be based upon what their treatment facility can handle, and that's not going to change. So I guess you're going to run into an environment like here in San Diego, where we have so many breweries that the small volume guys are now causing a little bit of a problem because there's so many of them, and altogether the volume brings that number up. And so they're starting to monitor smaller and smaller facilities just so they can really get a grasp of what's going into the system, because they don't really know yet which breweries are contributing more harmful things to the system than others. But we try to set up our system so that we're designing a facility that has a way to mitigate that before it ever hits the drain. Balancing things in place or doing on-site treatment if needed, depending on their volumes. But really no change in what it's doing, other than maybe looking at the smaller guys a little bit closer, because it's in an area where there may be multiple small breweries.
Are you finding that people, when they're looking at building or opening a new brewery, that they're looking for more energy efficiencies and some climate awareness stuff?
Everybody, is looking for the most efficient way to do it, but it really comes down to cost. It's very few and far between with you get the client that's willing to spend more to be more environmentally responsible. They're looking for ways to be environmentally responsible, but stay within their budget. And if it means, like a solar system is a great idea, but it's a fairly long return on investment for some of them. And if you don't own the building, there's really no benefit to you to buy a system that might take you 8 years to pay off, because if you're not there 20 years, then you're not getting the full benefit of that monetary investment. We see that more on if you're going to own the building or build new, building more into that, because it not only adds value to your business, but also to the property. Should the business not survive for any reason, the property is more valuable because of some of those things that you've built into it. But all of our systems, we try to design in as much reuse of wash down water and reuse recapturing heat systems. A lot of that's really kind of more done on the equipment supplier side, but we can make recommendations for what's right for our client, and a lot of it depends on what the fuel source is available for them. If natural gas isn't available, then what does that mean as far as looking at electric or propane fed systems and understanding what that cost to operate those systems is going to be. We're starting to see some conditions here where they're starting to not want to build natural gas systems into new developments, which I'm not sure how that's going to pan out in the long term because of the cost of the alternative fuels versus natural gas. Natural gas is one of the least expensive and most efficient fuels out there for operating a brewery in different types of industries like this.
Do you recommend that people, regardless of whether they're building or whether they're renting, that they find spaces that they could add on to or lease more of, and start smaller, or buy a bigger space?
Yeah,
lease a
absolutely.
bigger space?
Be in a place where you can, if you're leasing it, maybe you get first right of refusal on an adjacent space. And if we know that's going to happen, we can design the layout of that system so that expanding over next door, whether it's for additional dry storage, cold storage, or maybe even expanding your cellar, it would be as efficient as possible. Just a matter of taking down a wall and moving equipment over. One thing we don't really try to avoid is doing anything that would change the actual brew house itself. We can design it so that you can add vessels to it, so maybe increase the efficiency of that system, but you're typically not going to want to remove a system and replace it with a larger system. You can, but there's a cost to that needs to be understood. And people say, I'm just going to start with a 10 and start with a 5-barrel system. In a couple of years, I'm going to switch it out to a 10. Well, I would caution against that because of that cost and the downtime you're going to have. I'd rather see you maybe start with a 7-barrel system and just don't produce as much, don't brew as often, and ramp up your production as you go, or even start with the bigger system and half batch into it and then full batch into it when you're ready, because changing out that entire system is kind of a big deal. Expanding your cellar is easy, but changing your brew house is a big deal.
Are you suggesting at this point, or do you think it's smart at this point to recommend not purchasing equipment from overseas?
If you're purchasing it, there's kind of a twofold here. So you have American made is going to cost you more. There are plenty of American suppliers that are sourcing their equipment from overseas. And then there are a lot of overseas direct systems that you can buy. If you're not getting it through a broker or a supplier in the US and it's still coming from overseas, or if you're going direct, having a very good way to check the quality, your quality assurance, and being able to stay on top of it, and communication is a huge key. We've done several breweries that were direct systems, and there's been some issues. I think some of it is language barrier. Some of it has just been not being able to stay on top of the quality assurance that you can get from buying from someone that may source their equipment from overseas. Once it gets here, they do their own QA, they do some mods to it, and then send it to you. That can be a good way to get it with a little bit more guarantee and a little more security in it.
I would imagine that there are people that you work with more often, but that anything goes in terms of what shows up in the space.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, we've had problems with systems from some of the biggest name suppliers and from the small suppliers. It just because you're getting it from a well reputable supplier doesn't mean you may not have a bad weld here and there. That's just something that happens. It's no different than in construction. You can have the best contractor, even the best architect that can still, can miss something or you kind of always run into that scenario. But having someone on your team that can conduce a little bit of that quality assurance goes a long way. We try to do that on our end as far as whether it's vetting the contractor or even sometimes vetting the supplier, and we start having conversations with them, and I hear what the client is asking for of the supplier, and the supplier is not really answering the question, and we start to have that conversation with the client. Is this the right supplier for you? And we've had those uncomfortable conversations, but sometimes it's got to happen. We're in it to look out for the best interest of our client and get them off to the best foot possible. I'll give them all the information, let them make the decision, but I want them to make an informed decision on what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Dana, do you want to talk about the passivation?
Yeah, just what he just said is exactly what I'm seeing as well. The stuff coming over from China can be really good or it can be really bad. And it's, with really well-known companies and some that aren't so well-known, but I struggle with the ones that are, there's a lot of information out there on passivation that is I feel incorrect. And if they do it wrong, they can just ruin the metal. So it's real important for them to, work with a reputable chemical supplier that knows what they're doing on how to, treat the metal so it will be, not only in good shape, but won't affect the flavor of the, product that they're making.
I've actually sent people to the articles that you put in our library a couple of times now. I wouldn't have known that was a thing at all. So this is another one of those things I learned from our contributors when I'm looking through the articles. It's a good thing. Thank you very much. Anybody have any last questions? Slow it all down, wrap it all up. Awesome. Dustin, thank you so much for being here, for offering your insight.
No problem. Thank you for the opportunity.
Delighted. So thank you. And we will look forward to seeing you in July. Once again, that'll be July 20th. William Camacho is going to talk to us about pro forma. So a little bit of Dustin being the card in this case. And we'll put, a lot of times the pro forma comes first or in hand with working with Dustin in terms of the financial pieces. So we'll learn from William about that. I think that's all we have for today. Thank you again. Thanks to Dustin. Thank you everybody for being here, and we'll wish you a great, cool and easy summer afternoon.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay cool.
Yes,
Good to meet
thank
you all. Bye-bye.
Likewise.